Ok. Chị cứ lấy đi. Imagine communities. Like the nuclear family, the community could not completely disappear from our without emotional replacement. From our world without any emotional replacement. Markets and states today provide most of the material needs once provided by communities, but they must also supply triple bonds. Markets and states do so by fostering imagined communities that contain millions of strangers and which are tailored to national and commercial needs. An imagined community is a community of people who don't really know each other but imagine that they do. Such communities are not a novel invention. Kingdoms, empires, and churches functioned for millennia in imagined communities. In ancient China, tens of millions of people saw themselves as members of a single family, with the emperor as its father. In the Middle Age, In the Middle Age, millions of devout Muslims imagined that they were all brothers and sisters in the great communities of Islam. Yet, throughout history, such imagined communities played second fiddle to intimate communities of several dozen people who knew each other well. The intimate communities fulfilled the emotional needs of their members and were essential for everyone's survival and welfare. In the last 2 centuries, the intimate communities have withered, leaving imagined communities so filling the emotional vacuum. The two most important examples of the rise of such imagined communities are the nation and the consumer tribal. The nation is the imagined community tribe. Consumer tribe. The nation is the imagined community of the state. The consumer tribe is the imagined community of the market. Both are imagined communities because it's impossible for all customers in a market or for all members of a nation really to know one another the way villagers knew one another in the past. No German can intimately know the other 80 million members of the German nation, or the other 500 million customers inhabiting the European Common Market, which evolved first into the European Community and finally became the European Union. Consumerism and nationalism work extra hours to make us imagine that millions of strangers belong to the same community as ourselves, that we all have a common past, common interests, and a common future. This isn't a lie, it's imagination. Like money, limited liability companies, and human rights, nations, and consumers, tribes are intersubjective realities. They exist only in our collective imagination, yet their power is immense. As long as millions of Germans believe in the existence of a German nation, get excited at the sight of German national symbols, retell German national myths, and are willing to sacrifice money, time, and lives for the German nation, Germany will remain one of the strongest powers in the world. The nation does its best to hide the imagined character. Most nations argue that they are natural and eternal entity created in some primordial 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 epoch Epoch. Epic. How can it's pronounced as a C? Oh my god. Wrong. Epoch.
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 Epochs. A long period of time, especially one in which there are new developments and great changes. The president said that his country was moving into new kỷ nguyên mới.
Epoch.
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 Epoch. Primordial. Primordial. The most nations argue that they are natural and eternal entity created in some primordial some primordial epoch by mixing the soil of the motherland with the blood of the people. Yet such claims are usually exaggerated. Exaggerated.
Exaggerated.
Exaggerated. Exaggerated.
Exaggerated.
Exaggerated. Nations existed in the distant past, but their importance was much smaller. A resident of medieval Nuremberg might have felt some loyalty towards the German nations, but she felt far more loyalty towards her family and local community, which took care of most of her needs. Moreover, whatever importance ancient nations may have had, few of them survived. Most existing nations evolved only after the Industrial Revolution. The Middle East provides ample examples. The Syrian, Lebanese, Jordanian, and Iraqi nations are the product of haphazard borders drawn in the sand by French and British diplomats who ignore local history, geography, and economy. These diplomats determined in 1918 that the people of Kurdistan, Baghdad, and Basra would henceforth be Iraqis. It was primarily the French who decided who would be Syrian and who Lebanese. Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad tried their best to promote and reinforce their Anglo-French manufacturer nation consciousness. Their Anglo-French manufactured national consciousnesses, but their bombastic speeches about the allegedly eternal Iraqi and Syrian nations had a hollow ring. It goes without saying that nations cannot be created from thin air. Those who worked hard to construct Iraq or Syria made us of real historical, geographical, and cultural raw materials, some of which are centuries and millennia old. Saddam Hussein co-opted the heritage of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Babylonian Empire, even calling one of his crack armored unit the Hammurabi Division. Yet, that does not turn the Iraqi nation into an ancient entity. If I bake a cake from flour, oil, and sugar, all of which have been sitting in my pantry for the past 2 months, it does not mean that the cake itself is 2 months old. Division or division. Division.
Division.
Division.
Division. No one call it division. It's just
Division.
division. Okay. In recent decades, national communities have been increasingly eclipsed by tribes of customers who do not know one another intimately but share the same consumption habits and interests, and therefore feel part of the same consumer tribe and define themselves as such. This sounds very strange, but we are surrounded by examples. Madonna fans, for example, constitute a consumer tribe. They define themselves largely by shopping. They buy Madonna concert tickets, CDs, posters, shirts, and ringtones, and thereby define who they are. Manchester United fans, vegetarians, and environmentalists are other example. They too are defined above all by what they consume. It is the keystone of their identity. A German vegetarian might well prefer to marry a French vegetarian than a German carnivore. Perpetuum mobile. Perpetuum mobile. There is no wood. Perpetuum meaning. Perpetuous. Forever, everlasting, or perpetual. Perpetual mobile. Perpetual motion. A piece of fast-moving instrument music consisting mainly notes of equal length. Động cơ vĩnh cửu. The revolutions of the last 2 centuries have been so swift and radical that they have changed the most fundamental characteristic of the social order. Traditionally, the social order was hard and rigid. Order implies stability and continuity. Swift social revolutions were exceptional, and most social transformation resulted from the accumulation of numerous small steps. Humans tended to assume that the social structure was inflexible and eternal. Families and community might struggle to change their place within the order, but the idea that you could change the fundamental structure of the order was alien. Alien. Alien.
Alien.
Alien.
alien, alien,
Alien.
alien,
Alien.
Alien. Fundamental structure of the order was alien. People tended to reconcile themselves to the status quo, declaring that this is how it always was and this is how it always will be. Over the last 2 centuries, the pace of change became so quick that the social order acquired a dynamic and malleable nature. It now exists in a state of permanent flux. When we speak of modern revolution, we tend to think of 1789, the French Revolution, 1848, the Liberal Revolution, or 1917, the Russian Revolution. But the fact is that these days every year is revolutionary. Today, even a 30-year-old can honestly tell disbelieving teenagers, when I was young, the world was completely different. The internet, for example, came into wide usage only in the early 1990s, hardly 20 years ago. Today, we cannot imagine the world without it. Hence, any attempt to define the characteristic of modern society is akin to defining the color of a chameleon.
Akin.
Akin. Having of the same quality, we call it akin. Having some of the same quality. Society is akin to defining the color of a chameleon. Kỳ nhông. The only characteristics of which we can be certain is the incessant change. People have become used to this, and most of us think about the social order as something flexible, which we can engineer and improve at will. The main promise of pre-modern rulers were to safeguard the traditional order, or even to go back home, lost golden age. In the last 2 centuries, the currency of politics is that it's promised to destroy the old world and build a better one in its place. Not even the most conservative of political parties vote merely to keep things as they are. Everybody promises social reform, educational reform, economic reform, and they often fulfill those promises. Just as geologists expect that tectonic movements will result in earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, so might we expect that drastic social movements will result in bloody outbursts of violence. The political history of the 19th and 20th century is often told as a series of deadly wars, holocausts, and revolutions, like a child in a bush leaping from puddle to puddle. This view sees history as leapfrogging from one bloodbath to the next, from World War One to World War Two, to the Cold War, from the Armenian genocide to the Jewish genocide to the Rwandan genocide, from Robespierre to Lenin to Hitler. There's two here, but this all too familiar. The list of calamities is somewhat misleading. We focus too much on the puddles and forget about the dry land separating them. The late modern era has seen unprecedented levels not only of violence and horror, but also of peace and tranquility. Charles Dickens wrote the French Revolution that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This may be true not only of the French Revolution, but of the entire era it heralded. It is especially true of the 7 decades that have elapsed since the end of World War II. During this period, humankind has for the first time faced the possibility of complete self-annihilation and has experienced a fair number of actual wars and genocide. Yet these decades were also the most peaceful era in human history, and by a wide margin. This is surprising because these very same decades experienced more economic, social, and political change than any previous era. The tectonic plates of history are moving at a frantic pace, but the volcanoes are mostly silent. The new elastic order seems to be able to contain and even initiate radical structural changes without collapsing into violent conflict. Peace in our time. Peace in our time. Okay. Most people don't what? Hello. Most people don't appreciate just how peaceful an era we live in. None of us was alive 1,000 years ago, so we easily forget how much more violence the world used to be. And as wars become more rare, they attract more attention. Many more people think about the wars raging today in Afghanistan and Iraq than about the peace in which most Brazilians and Indians live. Even more importantly, it's easier to relate to the suffering of individuals than of entire population. However, in order to understand macro-historical processes, we need to examine mass statistics rather than individual stories. In the year 2000, wars caused the death of 310,000 individuals, and violence crime killed another 520,000. Each year, every victim is a world destroyed, a family ruined, friends and relatives scarred for life. Yet from a macro perspective, these 830,000 victims comprise only 1.5% of the 56 million people who died in 2000. That year's 1.26 million people died in car accidents, 2.25% of total mortality, and 850,000 people committed suicide, 1.45%. The figures for 2002 are even more surprising. Out of 57 million dead, only 172,000 people died in war and 569,000 died of violent crime. A total of 741,000 victims of human violence. In contrast, 873,000 people committed suicide. It turns out that in the year following the 9 out of 11 attacks, despite all the talk of terrorism and war, the average person was more likely to kill himself than to be killed by a terrorist, a soldier, or a drug dealer. In most parts of the world, people go to sleep without fearing that in the middle of the night a neighboring tribe might surround their village and slaughter everyone. While British subjects traveled daily from Nottingham to London through Sherwood Forest without fear that a gang of merry green-clad brigands will ambush them and take their money to give to the poor, or more likely murder them and take the money for themselves. Students brook no canings from their teachers. Children need not fear that they will be sold into slavery when their parents can't pay their bills. And women know that the law forbids their husband from beating them and forcing them to stay at home. Increasingly around the world, these expectations are fulfilled. The decline of violence is due largely to the rise of the state. Throughout history, most violence resulted from local feuds, an argument, feud,
feud, feud,
Feud.
feud. An argument. Okay. An argument that has existed for a long time between two people or a group, causing a lot of anger and sometimes violence. Even today, as above figures indicate, the local crime is a far deadlier threat than international wars. As we have seen, early farmers who knew no political organization larger than the local community suffered rampant violence. As kingdoms and empires became stronger, they reigned in communities and the level of violence decreased. In the decentralized kingdoms of medieval Europe, about 20 to 40 people were murdered each year for every 100,000 inhabitants. In recent decades, when states and markets have become all powerful and communities have vanished, violence rates have dropped even further. Today, the global average is only 9 murders a year per 100,000 people, and most of these murders take place in weak states such as Somalia and Colombia. In the centralized states of Europe, the average is 1 murder a year per 100,000 people. There are certainly cases where states use their power to kill their own citizens, and these often loom large in our memories and fears. During the 20th century, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people were killed by the security forces of their own states. Still, from a macro perspective, state-run courts and police forces have probably increased the level of security worldwide, even in oppressive dictatorships. The average modern person is far less likely to die at the hand of another person than in pre-modern societies. In 1964, a military dictatorship was established in Brazil. It ruled the country until 1985. During these 20 years, several thousand Brazilians were murdered by the regime. Thousands more were imprisoned and tortured. Yet, even in the worst year, the average Brazilian in Rio de Janeiro was far less likely to die at human hands than the average Guarani, Arawat, or Yanomato. The Guarani, Arawat, and Yanomato are indigenous people who live in the depths of the Amazon forest without army, police, or prisons. Anthropological studies have indicated that between a quarter and a half of their menfolk die sooner or later in violent conflicts over property, women, or prestige. Imperial retirement. It's perhaps debatable whether violence within states has decreased or increased in 1945. What nobody can deny is that international violence had dropped to an all-time low. Perhaps the most obvious example is the collapse of the European empires. Throughout history, empires have crushed rebellions with an iron fist, and when its day came, a sinking empire used all its might to save itself, usually collapsing into a bloodbath. Its final demise generally led to anarchy and wars of succession. Since 1945, most empires have opted for peaceful early retirement. Their process of collapse became relatively swift, calm, and orderly. In 1945, Britain ruled a quarter of the globe. 30 years later, it ruled just a few small islands. In the intervening decades, it retreated from most of its colonies in a peaceful and orderly manner. Though in some places, such as Malaya and Kenya, the British tried to hang only by force of arms, in most places they accepted the end of empire with a sigh rather than with a temper tantrum. They focused their efforts not on retaining power, but on transferring it as smoothly as possible. At least some of the praise usually heaped on Mahatma Gandhi for his nonviolent creed is actually owing to the British Empire. Despite many years of bitter and often violent struggle, when the end of the Raj came, the Indians did not have to fight the British in the streets of Delhi and Calcutta. The empire's place was taken by a slew of independent states, most of which have since enjoyed stable borders and have for the most part lived peacefully alongside their neighbors. Tens of thousands of people perished at the hands of the threatened British Empire, and in several hot spots its retreat led to the eruption of ethnic conflicts that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, particularly in India. Yet, when compared to the long-term historical average, the British withdrawal was an exemplar of peace and order. The French Empire was more stubborn. Its collapse involved bloody rearguard actions in Vietnam and Algeria that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the French too retreated from the rest of their dominions quickly and peacefully, leaving behind orderly states rather than a chaotic free-for-all. The Soviet collapse in 1989 was even more peaceful, despite the eruption of ethnic conflict in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Never before has such a mighty empire disappeared so swiftly and so quietly. The Soviet Empire of 1989 has suffered no military defeat, except in Afghanistan, no external invasion, no rebellion, nor even large-scale Martin Luther King-style campaigns of civil disobedience. The Soviets still had millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks and aeroplanes, and enough nuclear weapons to wipe out the whole of humankind several times over. The Red Army and the other Warsaw Pact armies remained loyal. Had the last Soviet ruler, Mikhail Gorbachev, given the order, the Red Army would have opened fire on the subjugated masses. Yet the Soviet elite and the communist regimes through most of Eastern Europe, Romania and Serbia were the exceptions, chose not to use even a tiny fraction of this military power when its members realized that communism was bankrupt. They renounced force, admitted their failure, packed their suitcase and went home. Gorbachev and his colleagues gave up without a struggle not only the Soviet conquest of World War II, but also the much older Tsarist conquest in the Baltic, the Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Central Asia. It is chilling to contemplate that might have happened in Gorbachev and behaved like the Serbian leadership, or like the French in Algeria. Pax Atomi. What? Ka. Pax Atomica. Atomic peace. The independent states that came after these empires were remarkably uninterested in war, with very few exceptions. In 1945, states no longer invade other states in order to conquer and swallow them up. Such conquest had between the bread and butter a political history since time immemorial. It was how most great empire was established, and how most rulers and populations expected things to stay. But campaigns of conquest like those of the Romans, Mongols, and Ottomans cannot take place today anywhere in the world. Since 1945, no independent country recognized by the UN has been conquered and wiped off the map. Limited international wars still occur from time to time, and millions still die in wars, but wars are no longer the norm. Many people believe that the disappearance of international wars is unique to the rich democracies of Western Europe. In fact, peace reached Europe after it prevailed in other parts of the world. Thus, the last serious international wars between South American countries were the Peru-Ecuador Wars of 1941 and the Bolivia-Paraguay Wars of 1932 to 1935. And before that, there hadn't been a serious war between South American countries since 1879 to 1884, with Chile on one side and Bolivia and Peru on the other. We seldom think of the Arab world as particularly peaceful, yet only once since the Arab country won their independence has one of them mounted a full-scale invasion of another, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. There have been quite a few border clashes, e.g. Syria versus Jordan in 1960, many armed intervention of one in the affairs of another, e.g. Syria in Lebanon, numerous civil wars, Algeria, Yemen, Libya, and an abundance of coups and revolts. Yet there have been no full-scale international wars among the Arab states except the Gulf War, even widening the scope to include the entire Muslim world. Adds only one more example, the Iran-Iraq War. There was no Turkey-Iran War, Pakistan-Afghanistan War, or Indonesian-Malaysian War. In Africa, things are far less rosy, but even there, most conflicts are civil wars and coups. Since African states won their independence in 1960s and 1970s, even few countries have invaded one another in the hope of conquest. There have been periods of relative calm before, as for example in Europe between 1871 and 1914, and they always ended badly, but this time is different. For real peace is not the mere absence of war. Real peace is the impossibility of war. There has never been real peace in the world. Between 1871 and 1914, a European war remained a plausible eventually, and the expectation of war dominated the thinking of armies, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. This forebody was true for all other peaceful periods in history. An iron law of international politics decreed for every two nearby polities, there is a plausible scenario that will cause them to go to war against one another within 1 year. This law of the jungle was enforced in late 19th century in Europe, in medieval Europe, in ancient China, and in classical Greece. If Sparta and Athens were at peace in 450 BC, there was a plausible scenario that there would be a war by 449 BC. Today, humankind has broken the law of the jungle. There is at last real peace, and not just absence of wars. For most polities, there are no plausible scenario leading to full-scale conflict within 1 year. What could lead to war between Germany and France next year, or between China and Japan, or between Brazil and Argentina? Some minor border clash might occur, but only a truly apocalyptic scenario could return in an old-fashioned full-scale war between Brazil and Argentina in 2014, with Argentinian armored divisions sweeping to the gates of Rio and Brazilian carpet bombers pulverizing the neighborhoods of Buenos Aires. Such wars might still erupt between several pairs of states, e.g. between Israel and Syria, Ethiopia and Eritrea, or the USA and Iran. But these are only the exceptions that prove the rule. This situation might of course change the future, and within hindsight, the world of today might seem incredibly naive. Yet from a historical perspective, our very naivety is fascinating. Never before has peace been so prevalent that people could not even imagine war. What is it? Scholars have sought to explain this happy development in more books and articles than you would ever want to read yourself, and they have identified several contributing factors. First and foremost, the price of wars has gone up dramatically. The Nobel Peace Prize to end all peace prizes should have been given to Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer and his fellow architects to the atomic bomb. Nuclear weapons have turned war between superpowers into collective suicide and made it impossible to seek world domination by force of arms. Secondly, while the price of wars soared, its profits declined. For most of history, polities could enrich themselves by looting or annexing enemy territories. Most wealth consisted of fields, cattle, slaves, and gold. So it was easy to loot in or occupy it. Today, wealth consists mainly of human capital, technical know-how, and complex socio-economic structures such as banks. Consequently, it is difficult to carry it off or incorporate it into one's territory. Consider California. Its wealth was initially built on gold mines, but today it's built on silicon and celluloid. Silicon Valley and the celluloid hills of Hollywood. What would happen if the Chinese were to mount an armed invasion of California, land of 1 million soldiers, on the beaches of San Francisco and storm inland? They would gain little. There are no silicon mines in Silicon Valley. The wealth resides in the minds of Google engineers and Hollywood script doctors, directors, and special effects wizards who would be on the first plane to Bangalore or Mumbai long before the Chinese tank rolled into Sunset Boulevard. It is not coincidental that the few full-scale international wars that still take place in the world, such as the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, occurred in places where wealth is old-fashioned material wealth. The Kuwait scathe could be flee abroad, but the oil fields stayed put and were occupied. 43 and 44 gold miners in California during the gold rush, and Facebook headquarters near San Francisco in 1849. California built its fortune on gold. Today, California's is fortune on silicon. But whereas in 1949 the gold actually lays there in the Californian soil, the real treasures of Silicon Valley are locked inside the head of high-tech employees. Okay, so it's gold mines, employees. Trời ơi, qua kinh khủng. While war became less profitable, peace became more lucrative than ever. In traditional agricultural economies, long-distance trade and foreign investment were sideshows. Consequently, peace brought little profit, aside from avoiding the cost of war. If, say, in 1400, England and France were at peace, the French did not have to pay heavy war taxes to suffer destructive English invasions, but otherwise it did not benefit their wallets. In modern capitalist economy, foreign trade and investments have become all important. Peace therefore brings unique dividends. As long as China and USA are at peace, the Chinese can prosper by selling products to the USA, trading in Wall Street, and receiving US investments. Last but not least, a tectonic shift has taken place in the global political. Many elite in history, Hun, chieftains, Viking noblemen, and Aztec pariahs, for example, viewed war as a positive good. Others viewed it as evil, but an inevitable one, which we had better turn to our own advantage. Our is the first time in history that the world is dominated by a peace-loving elite. Politicians, business people, intellectuals, and artists who generally see wars as both evil and avoidable. There were pacifists in the past, such as the early Christians, but in the rare cases that they gain power, bề mặt tầng địa chất kiến tạo các mặt kiến tạo ở cái này mình có tôi lấy là bảng rồi, tectonic là kiến tạo. There were pacifists in the past, such as the early Christians, but in the rare cases that they gained power, they tended to forget about their requirement to turn the other cheek. There is a positive feedback loop between all these four factors. The threat of nuclear holocaust fostered pacifism. When pacifism spread, war recedes and trade flourishes, and trade increases both the profits of peace and the cost of war. Over time, this feedback loop creates another obstacle to war, which may ultimately prove the most important of all. The tightening web of international connections erodes the independence of most countries, lessening the chance that any one of them might single-handedly let slip the dogs of war. Most countries no longer engage in full-scale war for the simple reason that they are no longer independent. Though citizens in Israel, Italy, Mexico, or Thailand may harbor illusions of independence, the fact is that their governments cannot conduct independent economic or foreign policy, and they are certainly incapable of initiating initiating and conducting full-scale war on their own. As explained in Chapter 11, we are witnessing the formation of a global empire. Like previous empires, this one too enforces peace within its borders, and since its borders cover the entire globe, the world empire effectively enforces world peace. So is the modern era of one mindless slaughter, wars, and oppression, typified by the changes of World War I, the nuclear mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, and the gory manias of Hitler and Stalin, or is it an era peace epitomized by the trenches never dug in South America, the mushroom clouds that never appeared over Moscow and New York, and the serene visages of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King? The answer is a matter of timing. It is sobering to realize how often our view of the past is distorted by events of the last few years. If this chapter had been written in 1945 or 1962, it would probably have been much more glum. Since it had written in 2014, it takes a relatively buoyant approach to modern history to satisfy both optimists and pessimists. We may conclude by saying that we are on the threshold of both heaven and hell, moving nervously between the gateway of one and the anteroom of the other. History has still not decided where we will end up, and a string of coincidences might yet send us rolling in either direction. An intimate community is a group of people who know one another well and depend on each other for survival. Okay, so one blank page. And they live happily ever after. Okay. 20 page. 26 page. And 22 page. It is 6%. Okay. And they lived happily ever after. The last 500 years have witnessed a breathtaking series of revolutions. Hello. The Earth has been united into a single ecological and historical sphere. The economy has grown exponentially, and humankind today enjoys the kind of wealth that used to be the stuff of fairy tales. Science and the Industrial Revolution have given humankind superhuman powers and practically limitless energy. The social order has been completely transformed, as have politics, daily life, and human psychology. But are we happier? Did the wealth humankind accumulated over the last 5 centuries translate into a newfound contentment? Did the discovery of inexhaustible energy resources open before us inexhaustible stores of bliss? Going further back, half the 70 or so turbulent millennia since the cognitive revolution made the world a better place to live, was the late Neil Armstrong, whose footprint remains intact on the windless moon, happier than the nameless hunter-gatherer who 30,000 years ago left her handprint on a wall in Chauvet Cave? If not, what was the point of developing agriculture, cities, writing, coinage, empire, science, and industry? Historians seldom ask such questions. They do not ask whether the citizens of Uruk and Babylon were happier than their foraging ancestors, whether the rise of Islam made Egyptians more pleased with their lives, or how the collapse of the European empire in Africa have influenced the happiness of countless millions. Yet, these are the most important questions one can ask of history. Most current ideologies and political programs are based on rather flimsy ideas concerning the real source of human happiness. Nationalists believe that political self-determination is essential for our happiness. Consumption, communist, communist postulate that everyone would be blissful under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Capitalists maintain that only the free market can ensure the greatest happiness of the greatest number by creating economic growth and material abundance, by teaching people to be self-reliant and enterprising. What would happen if serious research were to disprove these hypotheses? If economic growth and self-reliance did not make people happier, what's the benefits of capitalism? What if it turns out that the subjects of large empires are generally happier than the citizens of independent states, and that, for example, Algerians were happier under French rule than under railroad? What would say that about the process of decolonization and the value of national self-determination? These are all hypothetical possibilities because so far historians have avoided raising these questions, not to mention answering them. They have researched the history of just about everything: politics, society, economics, gender, diseases, sexuality, food, clothing, yet they have seldom stopped to ask how these influence human happiness. Though few have studied the long-term history of happiness, almost every scholar and lay person have some vague preconception about it. In one common view, human capabilities have increased throughout history, since humans generally use their capabilities to alleviate miseries and fulfill aspiration. It follows that we must happier than our medieval have been happier than Stone Age hunter-gatherer.